Hey friends, it's TJ, and you're listening to Tea with TJ, where our love for tea, conversation, and self-improvement intersect. So let's take a deeper dive into my cup and let's have a chat. Hey friends, it's TJ. Welcome back to another episode of Tea with TJ, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Lonnie Woods III. Fun fact, I'm also a third, so that's something we have in common. Welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, TJ.
So very quickly for our audience, can you just tell me your story?
Sure. So my name is Lonnie Woods III. I'm an only child. And if you're not familiar with thirds, that means that my name is exactly the same as my father and my grandfather. Fun fact, but I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. So I come from a working class family from Baltimore, Maryland. I've always sort of been a creative kid, came up with a lot of love, a lot of support. And I then really sort of noticed that I was someone who wanted to do something creative. So once I went off to college, I was a first generation college student. I went off to college and I studied photography. And the story about that is really funny because I really just chose it off a whim because I went to the office of the college counselor and she was like, what do you want to do for your major? And I had just come back from our senior class trip and I took some photos and I was like flipping through a catalog. Literally, I feel so old because this is like early 2000s, no real internet for colleges or anything like that or websites. And I was like, flip to photography. And I was like, photography. So I'm a creative. I went to college, undergrad, I studied photography. And after that, I sort of discovered that another passion of mine was education. So during college, I started doing a lot of student leadership stuff. And I realized like, I really like art, but I really like helping people. So from there, I sort of like really thought, okay, I want to somehow combine the two, art and education. So I went and got a master's at NYU. And from there, I studied higher education and student affairs because I really wanted to work with art and design students to help them with their careers and advising and stuff like that. So that's kind of where my career has kind of gone to. I started off doing a lot of freelance photography stuff, and that's kind of moved into me working at art and design schools and helping students like I wanted to, and also have a freelance career where I do art direction and help brands out with their branding and stuff. So I've kind of like made a mashup of a career that's been really, fulfilling for me.
Nice. Awesome. I love that. And then I think are you in LA proper or in California?
Yes. I forgot to mention that. So I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, like I said, but then I moved to New York for grad school. Then I moved to DC and like the DMV area. Then I moved back to New York and now I'm in LA. So I reside now in sunny California, totally different world from the East Coast that I'm used to, but I've been here for about 2 years.
And I'm just curious. I mean, this, has no bearing on the episode, but as an East Coast person and like growing up in Baltimore, what prompted the move to LA? Because I feel like usually people who live on the East Coast are like, I'm staying over here. I'm not making the jump.
Exactly. No, that's a really great question. And I think my answer always shocks people because oftentimes people ask me that, especially people here in California, like, what made you come? And it really was mental health. It was mental health. I was living in New York during the pandemic. And as you probably remember, it was just a different city. And I don't think the city or the world has really come back from that. But I think for the first time I started experiencing, I was slowing down enough to notice that I had seasonal depression because I was in the house during the winter. And I was in a really weird place with my career at the time, dealing with a lot of stressors. And I just felt myself sort of needing a change. I've always kind of been a traveler. Like I said, I moved around a bit. I did a bunch of internships. Like I did an internship in California in undergrad. So I've always knew that I was going to move around. I didn't know where. So it was really mental health. I felt like I needed to be somewhere that had better weather year round to help me with that seasonal depression. And also just the city changing so much in New York. I didn't feel like it was the same city. And I felt a little the pandemic, I felt a little like boxed in. So I wanted like a different pace. So that's kind of what brought me here. But I am being here. To your point, I always knew that I wouldn't be here forever, but it really has solidified that I'm a true East Coaster. I love the Northeast. It's just a totally different world over here on the West Coast, in some good ways, in some bad ways, but it's definitely solidified that I am an East Coaster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't think I could do the West Coast. I've been a few times, and there's just something about big cities that are just so special to me.
Same.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. I didn't know that was the reason why
That
you
was
moved.
the catalyst. It was really like a low almost, honestly. It was a low moment of like trying to feel better and to just have, one thing about me I think that's really interesting is that I know people shun this in some ways, but I wouldn't say I'm a runner, but we can talk about that later when we get into the topic. But
Okay.
I think that I have learned in my life that I really believe in like that quote about like things that you can control and things you can't control and knowing the difference, the serenity prayer. And I think that I really pay attention to the things that I can control, and moving locations is something that I can control. So usually when I get to some type of like intersection in life, I'm probably thinking about moving. So that's a part of it as well.
Huh. I love that. I feel like we're gonna have another conversation about this because I have
It's going to
questions.
circle back. It's going to circle back. I'm sure.
So when we met and discussed having you on the show, which I was honored that you wanted to be on Tea with TJ. I felt very special, and you have a podcast as well. Where can folks find that and listen to it?
Yes, I'm honored to be here, and I'm so glad that you accepted. My podcast is called What I Did Wrong, and you can find it everywhere you podcast, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. And it's a podcast just all about life and mistakes, because I found that as I was going through some of the toughest times in my life, there wasn't a lot of like information out there about how to recover from mistakes and also not be shameful in the mistakes we make. So I made a whole podcast about different mistakes I've made in life, and I've had some guests on to talk about their mistakes, and they're kind of topical life topics, but the goal is to like remove the shame from making mistakes, and really like how do we use that to fuel who we are now, as opposed to thinking about the mistakes we made.
I love that.
Yeah.
So when we spoke about having you on, we were throwing around topic ideas for you, and you just claimed earlier that it was my suggestion, so I'll take it, I guess. But we wanted to discuss relationships, which
Yes.
interesting because I don't think I've had anyone on to date that has brought up relationships. I know I've covered it before in like season 1 when it was just me in front of the mic, but I'm curious to know what about that topic kind of like speaks to you, or like taps your soul in a way to want to have a discussion about it.
Absolutely. I think as I've been aging, I'm 39, and as I've reflected on a lot of life and decisions and thoughts and what life really means, I realized that it all comes down to relationships, for better or for worse. If we think about relationships with our parents, childhood trauma, that's relationships. If we think about dating, we think about sexuality, identity, we think about teachers. Everything that we experience in this life really comes down to relationships, community, and stuff like that. So I think for me, the thing that kind of sparked it is in one of the episodes, there was a small piece about polyamory. And I'm someone who identifies as poly, and I feel that there is such a stigma and or a lack of information and a lack of representation, I think, for queer Black men, especially, to really have conversations about that in a way that is grounded and that is, coming from a place of a sincere place. So, and then the other reason why this topic of relationships sort of was something I thought we could talk about is that I'm a poet as well. So I'm working on my second book of poetry, and I always knew, like, I got this like That's So Raven vision when I was finishing my first book, that my second book was going to be about basically affirmations for Black gay men around relationships and
Mm,
forming our own uh, relationship structures and ideas around desire as it pertains to romantic relationships. And I always knew that this was probably going to be a struggle for me to write because I'm not in a relationship and I wasn't at the time. And I was looking at the universe like, this is
mm,
going to be very vulnerable for me because I'm not in love and you want me to like write
mm,
this book of like positive affirmations around
mhm,
creating the relationships you want. So I think it's just the space that I'm in where I feel like I'm a vessel
mhm,
and I don't feel like you have to be going through a specific thing to share thoughts,
mm.
about a topic. So
Yeah, interesting. I love that.
yeah,
And I can't wait for that book to come out. I'm very, very intrigued.
for sure.
What would you say has been like the most impactful relationship in your life today?
Ooh, that's a great question. And you ask great questions, by the way.
Thank you.
I would have to say my mom, my relationship with my mother. I'm an only child raised by a single mother. And that relationship really defines who I am, who I become, who I want to be proud of.
Mm,
And my mom really fostered this sense of self that I have. I'm really self-assured and she's always been instrumental in like pouring back into me and like making sure that my identity was always protected, but also that I was in the driver's seat of who I wanted to be in the world. And that is like lasting impact that I think I'll have across my whole life. So yeah, I would say that's probably the most important relationship for
mm.
sure.
I love that. I have a similar background to you. My mom and dad got a divorce when I was 6 or 7, I believe. And for a good chunk of my life, I grew up in a single parent home until she remarried. But it was
Yeah.
interesting. It's interesting to think back on it now as an adult and look at that moment in time when it was just the two of us and how impactful it was in my life. Because I don't think, like, even listening to you talk about your mother, I'm thinking back to those moments and I'm like, oh, yeah, it was me and her versus the world, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
um, which has kind of like influenced and informed the way I kind of move through life, even in my current relationship or even like the relationships that I have with other people, whether they be platonic or friendships, or even creative relationships. There's something special about having someone on your side or having someone in your corner that truly believes in you and believes in what you bring to the table and what you can provide to the world, just as a human being. I think that is something that is really unique and special when it comes to relationships that are paternal. And I think even more specifically, Black people, folks who look like us, I think there is even more nuance with our relationships because there's so much stuff wrapped up in it. Do you feel like you've had any relationships with people of color, whether they be romantic, platonic, professionally, creatively, that have kind of influenced who you are outside of the relationship with your mother?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right about people of color, Black folks especially. Relationships show up very differently for us, and then when you add in the intersectionality of being queer,
Hmm.
being gay, being whatever, I think I was actually thinking, as a side note, before I answer your question, I was thinking about this earlier about like queer folks and how our we can sometimes blur the lines of platonic and romantic. I think
Hmm.
easier than heteronormative folks, and
Hmm.
I think in some ways that's looked at as a bad thing. And I don't think it's good or bad, but I've noticed
Hmm.
that it's something that that happens. I think maybe more often, but I
Hmm.
think it goes into the idea of found family or chosen family, right? Like you
Hmm.
think about like you know. Houses for Vogue and for
Hmm.
voguing houses and how there's like house mothers and things like that when we're like kind of like sometimes disenfranchised as it pertains to community. So I think we find community and cherish it sometimes differently than others. But
Hmm.
yeah, I can think of multiple examples. Close friends. There actually was someone that I used to work with that was a supervisor of mine. And I
Hmm.
was actually just telling this story to my best friend yesterday, and this was the first time that I had a Black supervisor,
Hmm.
and I had built a relationship with this person that became more than just a supervisor. It was like a friend. It was a mentor. It was
Mhm.
someone that I trusted. And just as a background for me, like I've only worked in like predominantly white institutions. I only went to predominantly white schools. I grew up in a black city, but my professional life has been very white. And typically I'm the only one because in the art and design fields, there are
Mhm.
very few people of color in like certain areas. And so I came into that role guarded, just like, okay, like I don't know what to expect from this relationship. I want to keep it professional, which we did. But during the pandemic, I think all of us got so vulnerable. Like the world was just in shambles.
Yeah.
And there were moments where it was like, this person is someone that I can trust. This is a relationship that will go beyond this moment for me. And that was really defining for me because me as an educator, I often think about the impact I have on people in
Mhm.
that way. And of course, I don't always get to keep in touch with former students or
Mhm.
anything like that. But just to know that that relationship can be so either detrimental or beneficial to a student or a coworker or someone you're supervising, it just really just shifted a little bit of my brain chemistry around what that could really look like when
Mhm.
black folks are in power. Because the only way that happened was because she was in a position of power as a director to even
Mhm.
be my supervisor. So that's a whole nother
Mhm.
DEI discussion, but
Well,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah.
I want to go back and touch on something that you mentioned that I I completely am tapped into with you. That this idea of like chosen family and how the lines are blurred for us.
Yeah.
Weird, like our platonic relationships can become romantic, and I won't even put all of it on romantic. I will say that I've also encountered a lot of platonic relationships that have blurred the line into some type of sexual space or some type of intimate space.
Yeah.
Um, in not to even make it all about sex, because I don't believe that everything is about sex, but a certain level of intimacy that does exist in certain relationships that can be platonic or that started off platonic. Um, there's something unique, I think, about um, being queer and specifically being a queer person of color, um, when it comes to that blurred line. I think, and I am no therapist, I am not a scholar, I am merely someone with lived experience commenting on this. But I think I'll use my own life as an example that, you know, growing up in the South, for the majority of the time in a single parent home, someone who was trying to navigate his sexuality and trying to figure out where I fit in the world and what that meant and the definition of being at that time using only the terminology of gay. Now understanding that I'm more queer than anything. Um, Being in that space and trying to, especially at like 16, trying to figure out what I like, who I like, um, while also trying to make friends and like be just a normal person, a normal human, right? On top of trying to get through high school, right? Trying to figure out college, trying to figure out my life, trying to figure out what's next. There's so much stuff wrapped up in that. And I think the benefit that I have found or that I can look back on now is that some of those relationships that were intimate, that started off as a friendship, I think taught me a lot about myself and allowed me space to really explore myself and figure out what I actually liked in a safe environment. Because I feel like there's a lot of spaces, especially at that age, where you can get kind of wrapped up, quote unquote, into the wrong thing. Have you had any of those types of experiences, maybe in your younger life, where a relationship has developed from something that was initially platonic as a friendship and then developed into something more either romantic or intimate?
Hmm. Not so much, but I definitely had relationships when I was younger. When I look back to your point,
Mhm.
I'm like, oh wow, there was a connection and attraction there. And I
Mhm.
think that that is why I get so frustrated about when we talk about in the US, this idea of like sexual health or sexual education, how young we should talk about certain things. I think
Mm-hmm.
this is a really great conversation when we talk about like what's appropriate. But
Mm-hmm.
I think talking about attraction is super important, just attraction, right? Because you talk to anybody who's queer, we before we came out, typically we thought like, oh, I always felt something, and it's like we couldn't put a name to it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why people don't like that we exist and we show up, because we're putting a name to something that's real.
Mm-hmm.
And when you don't have a word for what you're feeling, and that could be in any realm of life, that's really harmful, because you're like, you feel like something's wrong. Is something wrong with me? You know, you're hearing all these messages from church and
Mm-hmm.
culture, and you never really heard someone say like, hey, some people are attracted to the same gender. It's like, what would that look like? You know, if I had heard that when I was like 7 or 8, I would have been like, oh, okay. It wouldn't have made me go do anything, but I think I would have just been like, oh, okay, this is what I'm feeling. This boy over there is cute.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happens, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I can think of a friend I had back in middle school, and we were best friends, and come to find out later we're both queer, and like we never talked about it. And I think that was what was so beautiful about our relationship, is that it wasn't built on sexuality or anything, but it was just built on a common connection, and we just became friends. And it was like, I think growing up in Baltimore, which is a very not always the most safest place, especially like being a certain type of person and looking a certain type of way, showing up a certain type of way. And I think when I found him, I found the first person where I was like, oh, there's somebody out there like me. And I didn't know it was because he was queer, and I don't think it's just because he's queer, but
Mm-hmm.
it was like he liked the same things I liked. He liked the same music I like. He was kind, and
Mm-hmm.
you know, he was nice to me, and stuff like that. So
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. Now I would say like in my adult life, I've definitely seen people have exes that they're still friends with, or
Mm-hmm.
express like for a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen different variations of that. I would say recently, and this is kind of like, I didn't think this would come up, but whatever. Recently I had my first time where, you know how you have a friend, and I've seen this on TV. I never thought it would happen to me. You have a friend and you're like, I actually like this person. Uh-oh.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
should I tell them, and all the emotions that come along with that. And,
Mm-hmm.
that didn't go the way I thought it would, you know. But that happened to me in my 30s, you know, last year, where I
Mm-hmm.
had a friend, and I kind of had a crush on this person, and it wasn't like a long friendship. So I felt like
Mm-hmm.
there was potential for it to go either way. And
Mm-hmm.
I went back and forth on whether I should say something, and I did. And they didn't necessarily feel the same way, and they were going through different things in their life and stuff like that. So that was a very interesting thing from an ego perspective. I never knew what that felt like, and I understand why people say, oh, I'll just keep it to myself, I'll take it to the grave,
Yeah.
because it can be disappointing if you know the person doesn't feel the same way. But I think it's still important to say it, because I think it can get in the way of the friendship.
Mm.
So
I was going to say I agree. I think that's even in this space, because this show has always lived in this like self-development space and vulnerable moments, and that is quoted by Jay the Gentleman from Dear Black Gay Men. Uh, but I agree that like, there's what is the use of holding on to stuff like that, right? Because you're always going to have this what if mentality if you don't share it. We had Will, what is Will's last name? Will Moore, William Sinclair Moore, on the show this season, and he said something in his episode that is still like living with me, where he was saying that there are so many moments in life where if someone says no, or like dismisses you, or discredits your feelings, right? So much stuff in you can die in that moment, and those doors can close, versus when you get a yes, and when you are receptive to someone, so many things can be birthed in that moment. And I think even in that exchange with your friend, again, just speaking from my own lived experience, those are the moments that are worth taking the risk, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen. Your whole thought process is purely perception of the situation from your side, and not necessarily the other person's, right? It could have been that the person was like, oh yeah, I was just waiting on you to, tell me,
exactly,
because I didn't want to make the
exactly.
first move. I even think about how the current relationship that I'm in, we've been together since 2007. And had I not taken the leap and actually spoke to this person, we would not be together, because he was very much like, I wasn't going to say anything because I thought you were straight. And I was very much like, no, like I was staring at you and wanting, some sort of acknowledgement of that, to like have an okay to say something to you. So yeah, it's beautiful in the sense that so many of our life's moments, and like very teachable moments, I think, exist in that space of like, just do it. Just take the risk. you know?
Absolutely. Yeah. You got me thinking about a couple of things. One is, the old time, you miss all the shots you don't take. I think
Mhm.
that applies across the board.
Mhm.
Or like, as my mom used to say, like, what are you going to lose? Like, the worst thing in this scenario that could happen is like the person could say no, or
Mhm.
whatever that means. But absolutely, I think you should. And I think what I've learned about that process, but also just even like going up to guys and, taking the first, like you said, like taking the first step to introduce myself and to start the conversation, is that I had to dig deep. And I'm not generalizing, audience, because I know I don't want anybody to come for me, but you can if you want. When we think about why we don't do things that we want to do,
Mhm.
you got to really look inward and say,
Mhm.
why am I not doing it? And for me, I'm only speaking for me. For me, it was a lack of a sense of self in terms of my confidence. Like, because my thought was like, well, what would you want someone to do? Oh, I would want someone to be confident and come up to me and say what's on their mind and introduce themselves. And I
Mhm.
would want, because I'm really attracted to confidence. And then I started taking an inventory of the things I like in
Mhm.
other men, whether they be celebrities. I think
Mhm.
about Lenny Kravitz, and I love that like androgyny and that like confidence to be a little bit different or whatever as a man. And I'm like, you like confidence, you like educated men, you like people that have a strong sense of style and self. And I'm like, and I asked myself, do you think you have all those things? This is like a conversation I have with myself. And I
Mhm.
said,
Love
yes. So I'm like, so why do you think that someone else is worthy of feeling like they can come up to you with all of
Mm.
that you say you have? So
Mhm.
then I just shifted my mind. I'm like, no, you have to stop. Like you really need to start doing this. So I think, to your point, you don't lose anything by being honest and being yourself. And if that includes telling a friend that it's not like I was in love with this person, but I'm like, hey, there's a romantic interest there. They were in a relationship when we first met. And so it was even more serendipitous, because I was like, wow, they just broke up, and like, here's my chance. Because in my mind, I'm like, this person's going to be with this person. So of course
Mm.
that will never happen. And I'll just keep it inside. And it wasn't like this burning thing where I'm like, oh my God, like,
Mhm.
I can't wait. I just want to have sex with you every time I see you. But
Mhm.
I felt like when that relationship ended I'm just like, wow, this seems like the universe is opening this up, at least for me to say something,
Mm.
So I agree with you. It builds your character, not in a toxic way, but in a way where, when I think about rejection, which is what I think a lot of men
Mhm.
fear,
Mhm.
and that's something that we don't often talk about, but we see the results of it all the time. It sometimes results in violence, or even worse, when
Mhm.
men get rejected. We need to learn how to cope with rejection, because that reject to me, it's not even a rejection. It's just like, someone doesn't want what you want.
Mhm.
That's not necessarily rejection. It's just like,
Mhm.
I had a desire that I would have loved to work a specific way, or at least to find out.
Yeah.
But when we think about breakups and we think about people not being interested in us, that and cheating on us and all that other stuff, I'm an Aquarius, and that this may be why I think like this, but
Mhm.
so they say we can be a little self-centered, but to me, none of that has anything to do with me.
Yeah.
It has nothing if someone cheating on me, it has nothing to do with me. But I know a lot of times we internalize rejection when it comes to relationships. We internalize, oh, I shot my shot, and this is why I don't do this. You did
Mhm.
it one time. The person
Exactly.
wasn't into it. There is someone else that would love it. And I will say that once I started, after I took that inventory, and I basically started, like, when I went out, not
Mhm.
all the time, but I would be more confident. And like, if I see something, say something, like in New York,
Mhm.
I was like talking to boys, like men, like, hey guys, I'm interested.
Mhm.
And what I learned is that I got more acceptance than I got rejection. I
Mm.
really did. And I'm not saying but I think that's what happens, is that we don't practice things enough to have enough data to say, well, actually, out of the 25 people I talked to, not that I keep track, one of them wasn't interested, but 24 of them was. It kind of built your confidence
Hmm.
So that's been helpful for me.
I love that. There's also um this space, I think, in I'm curious to know your thoughts because you've now done both coasts. But I feel like in New York specifically, there's a different type of energy here where people are, although from the outside it looks like people are closed off, people are actually pretty receptive in New York. Like if you approach someone and like speak to them like a normal person, not trying to sell them anything, because I feel like that is the thing in New York, is that you can walk down the street and someone's trying to sell you something, you're like, no, I don't have money, I don't have time. But if you genuinely want to have a connection with people, people are pretty receptive. Like the amount of times that I've connected with someone on the train or in a store or like at a coffee shop that I did not know, that I just so happened to see maybe like twice and commented on that and formed some type of relationship from that moment. Even if it's I'll use this as an example, like there's a coffee shop near my house that I go to every day. It got to the point where the baristas actually know my name now, know my order, and actually genuinely care about like how your day is going, right? Whereas if I had not engaged with them or had a moment with them first, or even allowed them in, right, to want to have a conversation with me, it could have been very closed off. It could have been very sterile. So I feel like those moments in New York do exist. I'm curious to know if those exist for you in LA.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I definitely see a difference between the East Coast and the West Coast as it pertains to those types of things.
Mhm.
I would say the difference is less about people wanting to be talked to and more about authenticity. I feel like,
Mhm.
and I think this is very common and very stereotypical, but I have the experience to say on
Yeah.
the East Coast, things are a bit more raw and real. So if someone likes you, whether you introduced yourself to them or not, it's
Mhm.
probably true. They
Mhm.
like you, like let's go. If I'm hollering, I really want to holler. If
Mhm.
I'm talking to you on the dating app, I really want to talk to you.
Mhm.
Here in on the West Coast, or at least in Los Angeles, I'd say there is a bit more of a sense of a veneer over everything sometimes. So someone might be showing interest, but they might not be interested, which is it's very
Mhm.
hard for East Coasters to deal with because we're so used to being direct and like, yo, you wasted my time. So
Yeah.
here, someone will meet you in the coffee shop and say, "Oh my goodness, I love your shirt. Let's hang
Mhm.
out. Let's hang out. You seem like a really cool person," and actually not mean it at all,
Mhm.
and flake and do all these things.
Yeah.
So that can be a bit disappointing. But yeah, absolutely. I think something you said earlier, I think is super important too. More people than not, I believe, want to be talked to,
Mhm.
and we're all at parties. Like when I hear people, including myself, I've done it too. You go to a party and you're like, that party was whack because everyone was in their group talking. So that gives me the clue that we all want to be talked to, but
Yeah.
we all like want someone else to do it.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if it was Gandhi or somebody who said like you have to be the change you want to see in the world. I'm misquoting, I think, the person, but I think it's really true. We have to start acting and coming up to people and talking and stuff like that. I think more not being afraid of the rejection, but it can be hard in cities like this where there is some disingenuous interactions. And the other thing you said reminded me of, this idea of, when you are thinking about connecting,
Mhm.
um, thinking about what your values are. Like,
Mhm.
what are my values as it pertains to relationships, friends? We often say that it's hard to make friends as adults, which I agree with.
Mhm.
But I think if you take a inventory of your values, sometimes it's easier to kind of connect with people across those values, and that can kind of take some of the pressure off
Mhm.
of meeting them because you have something in common that you really like whether it's art or
Mhm.
social justice or whatever the topic may be. Finding people in those spaces I found have been easier to connect with because
Mhm.
because it's just like you have something in common. It's funny, and I'll say one more story. This is funny. I'm kind of having flashbacks of my New York. Speaking
I
of
love
New York, I never said this publicly before, but I have a really fun story about meeting someone, a stranger. And this sounds like it's from a movie,
it.
but
Okay.
I promise it's true. I
Story.
once saw this guy on the train in the Bronx. I used to live in the Bronx before I
Mhm.
moved here, and he was really attractive. I found out later he was a model,
Mhm.
and something I've always had this like fantasy of airdropping a stranger And I've never done it. And I don't know what in my mind that morning allowed me to say, try to airdrop and see, because it was a very empty train. It was the morning. I was on my way to a doctor's appointment. So, it was early and, it wasn't that many people. And it was uptown. It was like the red line. So it wasn't like super crowded. It wasn't like the A or the CE. It was like the 3 or the 4. It was something that wasn't super busy. So it was just him. And I'm like, chances are he has a black name. You know what I mean? So if I open up my airdrop, if I see Jabarius or something, I'm like, that's him. And I actually forgot that I did this. This was so bold of me. I wrote a note in my phone and I screenshot like, hey, how are you? And I airdropped it to him. And I said, good morning. And we had a whole conversation back and forth by like airdropping these photos of notes. And I couldn't believe it. And then at the end, we exchanged phone numbers and it fizzled out and nothing happened. But I was like, you really just did that. Like, and it was something out of like a romantic comedy, but I really did it and it worked. And to my point, to your point, it works more than it doesn't. You just have to try, know? So yeah, I did that.
Jesus, I love that. That's such a New York story.
Such a New York story. So I think to your point, actually, I take that back. I think, New York is more susceptible to stuff like that. Like, I don't know if I could do that here. I don't know if that will work.
Yeah, true. I also feel like there's not a lot of opportunity. I mean, I've only visited and not lived there, but I would imagine there's not a lot of opportunity there for those types of moments, right?
It's not, because there's not as much public transportation. There's not as much walkable experiences. You're driving to everything. So here, community is very hard because you're not often forced to be with strangers. I was on my way to a doctor's appointment that morning and saw that guy on the train. That doesn't really happen here because I'm driving and stuff like that. But also just, I think there's just this fearlessness about the East Coast that I really like. There's just like, it is what it is, which I mean, can get you in trouble. Well, sometimes there is this just like boldness. And I don't know. It was the pandemic too. So I feel like the pandemic, my brain was just like, there's so much going on in the world. Why not? Like, I could die from COVID. So like, what is me like sending a note to this guy on the train? So
he's like, no, or declines it,
He says no.
I am thinking about that story. I'm baffled by that because that's such a New York moment and something that, like, if I saw that in a movie, I'd be like, that's so sweet. Like, I would want somebody to do that to me, or want to do that with me.
It would have been a good story if we like got married or something. Like, imagine that being the story at the wedding.
Yes,
like that would have been too bad that didn't work out, but that would have been a really cool origin story of a relationship.
It's interesting because I'm like, now that has me thinking. So, what in your, I would say, romantic relationships, because I feel like that's where we're leaning. And you said something that I feel like this question makes sense now. Where does self-love fall when it comes to forging relationships with people? Because I do believe there is, like you said earlier, like, there are certain things that people have to check off the list for you to, like, approach them / want to be approached by them. And I feel like self-love is a pivotal space in there. Where does that fall, and like, what does it look like for you?
It's a really good question. It's super important. In some ways, I think the answer to that question and even the concept of that is the reason why me and maybe some other people are single, right? I think when you are single and doing the work, the self-work, your value goes up. And I'm not talking about some high value red pill stuff, but your perspective of yourself goes up because you've done the work and you're like, wow, in order to do the work, you have to love yourself. And so it definitely is super important to me, especially because I am someone who really values, speaking of values, having my own mind, my own perspective, my own personality, my own life. So self-love is super important in relationships. Romantic, I'll stick to, is because when you seek a partner trying to find validation or completion, I
Mhm.
think that's when it can be really dangerous, because even if that's a good relationship, you're
Mhm.
expecting someone else to fill in the blanks
Mhm.
that you're missing. And I'm not talking about someone being complimentary, because I know there's this argument when people say things like, I'm saying that, like, oh no, there is a way that like a person is good at something that you're not. Yeah, that's different than what I'm saying. I'm talking about like self-value.
Mhm.
If I'm with you and I don't really, it's just like the thing I talked about approaching people.
Mhm.
The thing I had to get through was that you don't think that you deserve even to try to
Mhm.
talk to this attractive guy. Like
Mhm.
how, and that sounded crazy to me when I really sat back, like, oh wow, you don't think that you deserve a chance.
Mhm.
So the same with relationships, if your self-love is not in check, I think you can get into spaces where you are seeking out external validation from this partner or
Mhm.
from this, lover, that you don't actually feel for yourself. So then they're not validating something that you already believe.
Mhm.
They're actually the source
Mhm.
of this so-called truth about yourself. And I
Mhm.
think that can be really dangerous. So for me, I think when I go into relationships, and the way I think about it is, yeah, self-care is important. I think solo dates are important. I think spending time with yourself, your friends,
Mhm.
still having practices that are healthy practices outside of that person, that feeds into Lonnie. Like, what does Lonnie like to do? Like, I'm an avid thrifter. I like
Mhm.
to go hiking. I like to drink wine. I like to, like, connect with my friends. I got to make sure that I maintain that, my looks and my style and stuff, for me first,
Mhm.
even in a relationship, because if not, I think it's easy for that validation to be dependent on the lover.
I completely agree. I think that is something that, being on the other side of 30, I finally realized for myself. And I think, although I'm grateful for the relationship that I'm in, it was one of the nuances about our relationship that I didn't realize until I was older, that I spent so much of 18 to 25 with this one person, and kind of like hinged at the hip, so to speak, to where I had kind of lost. I don't want to say lost, because I don't mean it in that way, but I was still figuring out who I actually was, right? And being able to navigate all that, and now being 35, I know the things that I like. I know the things that I don't like, right? I know when I need time to myself, don't talk to me. I need time to myself. I need to go for a walk. I need to have a cup of tea. I need to go to a museum. I just need to go to the movies by myself. Um, and I think there's a lot of that type of thought that gets missed when you've been in a relationship very young and for such an extended amount of time prior to knowing who you actually are. And so I hope that's such a beautiful point and statement. I loved every moment of that. Um, I am curious to know from you, because you did mention this earlier, are there, in this idea of like self love, prior to entering into any type of relationship with someone else, not just romantic, what are some of those? You mentioned affirmations before. Like, what are some of those affirmations that you do have, to kind of just help you feed that self?
Absolutely. Something I didn't mention when you asked me why I moved to LA, I think part of the healing journey that I was on is that I had always gone to therapy, but during that time, I really had locked in with a therapist. And I remember on our first call, which was
Mhm.
actually kind of shocking, because I felt like I hadn't had a therapist say
Mhm.
something so direct to me before.
Mhm.
After our like consultation, and maybe the second or the first one, she told me that we would be working on my view of myself and my self worth.
Mhm.
And I was so offended. I was like, I'm so confident. What are you talking about? I'm a super confident person. And
Mhm.
she said, you are confident. But we basically, she was telling me that, let's dig deeper into the source of my confidence.
Mhm.
And at the time, the source of my confidence wasn't self worth. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh gosh, I didn't know that. The source
Mhm.
of my confidence was production. What could I produce? So I've
Mhm.
always been a high achiever, which
Mhm.
again, also there's some studies about Black queer people and overachieving. That's how we like move. That's how we show up.
Mhm.
And I was like, whoa, I actually haven't had a high value of self. I've just been really praised and excited about the things I've been able to accomplish. So anyway, that's something that came up in my therapy that leads to the answer about the affirmations, which is that you are enough at base level without doing anything for anyone else. Lonnie deserves love because it's his birthright, not because he has education or he's creative or he's cool, he can make you laugh. That has been a game changer for me. And it's still hard sometimes to receive love from my friends and even sometimes romantic partners because I'm so used to this default of my love being conditional to something I could do for the person subconsciously or do for the situation or me fixing something or saving something. Or even when I think about my family, even though I had I feel like I had a great upbringing, but when you are the prize, I was the prize student, the prize family, even my cousin, when I go back home, sometimes he's like, yo, you broke the family curse, and I think it's such a genuine thing to say, but that comes with an immense amount of pressure. But it also comes with this idea that I can perform my way out of my emotions and that my value is really about me like achieving and not about me being me. So that's one of the affirmations. And I think one of them is the other thing I'll say before I stop is it's not so much an affirmation, but I think I've learned that one thing that I value in relationships or I value in myself is I like being around people who also value people being themselves. So transparency, authenticity is a value of mine. And I've been in relationships before where I didn't know that this was a thing, but there are people who do not value authenticity. Some people, I'll say in my experience is what I've learned. It's like, some people actually value being chosen more than authenticity, because being chosen doesn't have to be authentic. So if I say this is my favorite cup, I don't have to mean that to make this cup feel like it's my favorite. So some people I've learned, and I'm not judging that, I'm just saying it's not a high value of mine to be chosen. Some people value being chosen. Some people value being married more than authenticity. So they be in a relationship that is not authentically happy, but because they're married, and I had to learn that. I'm like, everyone doesn't value authenticity. So for me, I want to be around people who are themselves. So my goal, to your point, is to try to be myself as much as possible around people and to vet out people who don't value that, because that type of relationship won't serve me at all.
I wish y'all could see my face right now because I'm agreeing with everything Lonnie is saying right now. I want to pin this because you just spoke to the depths of my soul. Confidence is not equal to your self-worth. Confidence is not equal to your self-worth. And your self-worth is not hinged on anyone else. Again, your self-worth is not hinged on anyone else. It's not conditional. So I just needed to say that because those two things just tapping right here. So friends, if you are loving this episode as much as I am right now, this is beyond what I could have asked for in an episode about relationships. We're going to end this right here and then come back and join us for part 2, which will be in the following week. Thanks so much for listening. This has been Tea with TJ, and I'll see you in part 2 next week. And that's our show, friends. Thanks for joining us on Tea with TJ. Please rate, review, and subscribe. And you can find us on Instagram at Tea with TJ Podcast. And as always, stay kind, keep sipping, and remember, we're here, so we might as well do it.